Welcome, everyone. Today I'm presenting my final project, which investigates how perceived observation and power dynamics shape the workplace culture at Dick's Sporting Goods and retail stores in general. By using an anthropological lens, I aim to show how managerial styles and surveillance don't just control what we do, but how we think and see ourselves. And this use of authority can also roll into how a workplace culture is formed by different managers, being either enjoyable to work in or horrible to work in. And I ultimately aim to connect this to larger forms of power, such as the government as well. My project starts with the idea that our behavior is deeply shaped by social context. We drive differently when we see a police car, and this same principle applies in retail. We work differently when we know a manager is watching. Uh, and my research question asks, how do different managerial styles and levels of authority influence our daily actions and communication patterns? To understand this, I started by looking at our textbook, Pembuck's Inequality, specifically the idea of social construction of reality, which is the concept that if enough people believe something is real, then it has real consequences, and that workplace reality is formed by behaviors of employees. And I also use Michael Foucault's concept of the panopticon, which explains how constant visibility leads to us becoming quote unquote docile bodies that monitor our own behavior because we might be watched at any moment. And that's something I'll touch on here in just a little bit. And the idea of structural systems are also brought up, how authority operates through individual managers and the visibility of structured systems. Um, the biggest part of my research was conducted through interviews, as well as the textbook and observation and my own personal experience. But I believe these interviews were the biggest source of my information, and I believe the most important part, and I reference them later on in this slideshow. And to get this research, I interviewed two of my former coworkers from my workplace of 5 years, which was the Carmel location of Dick's Sporting Goods. One of them was the assistant store manager of the particular location, who's worked at 5 other locations in his 13 years at the company. So his insight is very valuable because he's been through a whole bunch of different managers and a whole bunch of different positions with the company. And the other interview was with the online order lead from the same store, who's been with the company for 7 years now and has seen her fair share of managers cycling through the store. She's worked a few other locations as well, but this has been her main one. The first interview I conducted was with the manager, and some of the highlights that came out of this interview include a good management style includes being structured but not overbearing, keeping rules that make employees be the most inviting for customers possible, and keeping productive while also not being a micromanager was the best way to operate, even if the rules seemed a little strict. He was big on keeping AirPods out and being in uniform, but otherwise he kind of let you be autonomous in your work. And you as long as you follow the rules, he was okay. He was happy. He'd even let you have little prizes. But people would walk up to me all the time and tell me that he's too strict because he told them to take their AirPods out while talking to a customer, and that's just honestly being a courteous person, not just company policy. Um, Ultimately, employees often mold themselves to the manager they're working with so that they are able to please their expectations as much as possible. This is something that I experienced a whole lot when I worked. I would always like read the manager's schedule. I'd always have it on me so that I could tell who I'd be working with that day and, how I can act, more relaxed, or I'd have to be, pretty much on the entire time to make sure that they didn't get mad at me or anything. Different managers are heavy influences on the culture of a workplace, as the more relaxed managers tend to be more friendly with the employees, but the productivity of the store goes down slightly, while the more strict managers create a significantly harsher environment that generates more turnover because the employees feel uncomfortably pressured at all times. That's a pretty big point. Um, if you're kind of micromanaging and surveilling people all the time, the employees are going to eventually quit because they feel this pressure and uncomfortable with how you manage them. And it's something that people would tell me all the time. They put in their 2 weeks notice, and I'd ask them why, and it was generally never they got a new job. It was always they just didn't like how the management kind of watched them at all times. And ultimately, the behavior of the manager determined the culture, turnover rate, and behaviors of the employees. And that's just kind of the summary of what his interview was pretty big on. The second interview yielded pretty similar responses, but offers just a little bit more insight. She felt that managers were always watching, even if it wasn't, directly standing over the shoulder and watching. They had ways of figuring out what you were up to, and either through other employees or, watching cameras. And that's actually something I forgot to mention in the other interview. He admitted that early on in his career, when he was kind of a low-level employee, one of the managers that he worked with used to sit in the office of the store all day and watch the employees through the cameras that were placed throughout the store, backstock and on the floor. And he would yell at them to change their work via the microphone that the store provided, and not go up to them themselves and tell them how to fix their work or anything. And ultimately, that created a very toxic work culture because the employees kind of felt alone in every situation, because the manager wasn't with them on the floor helping them out. He was just watching them and micromanaging via cameras. Back to the interview. She doesn't really want to get caught slacking off, so she more or less attempts to look busy even when it is slow in order to prevent the manager from making them do something completely unnecessary, like, cleaning an area of the store that nobody's been to in 3 years, or, getting rid of a bunch of random things that nobody's ever seen. Uh, just ultimately time wasters. But she feels much more relaxed around a manager who's slightly strict but not abusive of their power, so that she knows things are getting done around the store, but in a much more comfortable environment. And that's, she was a big fan of the operations manager that I interviewed because that's exactly how he operated. He followed the rules, and he stuck to them, but he let you have fun while you were there. On Sundays he would actually, before the store opened, because we opened an hour later, we'd spend that extra hour before we open playing a game that he made up, throwing a football through the different sections of a ladder, or, playing spike ball with the team. It let us be ourselves and have fun. And, the winners always actually won little prizes. And, it was encouraging because, he understands that we're people too. And we don't like, being on in work mode all day, especially but when customers are involved. So he kind of let us have that little bit of fun before anything happened. Finally, strict managers often discourage teamwork because they will suspect that they're slacking, occurring rather than a productive team. That happened a lot in the store. It was kind of 50-50 whether teamwork was going to be good or bad. But the managers, the stricter ones, tended to lean into more theory X, and I'll explain that later. But they believed that these employees were generally just slacking off and being lazy, and they were just doing it with another person to make it look like they were working. And ultimately, that they discouraged teamwork because of that. And things were getting done a little bit less because there weren't two people working on it. It was one. So things got done slower, especially if that person got pulled away to help a customer or something. I'd also like to toss in some of my own personal notes, since I did work there for 5 years myself, and I've observed many things while researching this project as well as working there. And I would like to agree with the things that the interviews highlight, but I'd like to offer a few more things. I've been through my fair share of managers at my time in the store, on both ends of the spectrum. One was incredibly relaxed to a fault, as most nights I would end up closing the store with him. We'd end up playing football across the store. He'd be down on the first floor and I'd be up on the second floor, and we're just tossing football back and forth. And that's even while the store's open, so customers would see that. And they understand it's a relaxed environment, but they also understand that, we were slacking off and not doing our jobs. Um, as fun as these nights were, that I had closing, we always left early, 9:15 when the store closed at 9. We often got in trouble from the higher up managers, because we didn't clean up the store as we should have, and they were very mad about that. And ultimately, when they get mad at you, they get more strict at you, and then it's kind of a very, very bad domino effect, and it's kind of a hole that's very hard to dig yourself out of. But on the other hand, I've had managers that micromanage their entire day, and if you weren't doing exactly as he thought you were doing, you'd almost immediately get in trouble. And that created a very bad work environment, just because you feel like you're doing the right thing, you're doing something how you're supposed to be doing, when you're supposed to be doing it, and he'd come up and yell at you for every little thing and tell you to do something else that ultimately generally was a time waster, and it was very annoying and tedious work. In that, I have to say that the managers that had stricter rules, like AirPods out, be in uniform, and stay productive, but also encouraged teamwork, and let us be ourselves, were ones I had most fun with. The managers who understood that I liked to work, in teams on specific tasks, but alone on other tasks. The ones who understood that are the ones I had the most fun with, because I was able to be myself and work how I wanted to work and ultimately be the most productive. And, on those nights, we generally closed a little later than I wanted to, getting out at 10:30 instead of 9:15. But the store was clean. I never got in trouble, and I got paid more because I was there longer. I mean, you never complain about that. One small thing is I am in organizational leadership right now, and one thing of note that's come up that related very closely to this project was the idea of leadership versus management. The idea that leadership is being able to see everyone for their strengths and work with them to help them be at their best, while management involves being a little too close for the employee's comfort and making the job ultimately feel more pressure than it needs to. When managers begin to abuse their power, the role leads more to manipulation than leadership, and this can be more harmful for mental health and behaviors of the employee than they're able to realize. When the abuse of power turns into manipulation, it, again, generally creates a very toxic work environment that makes the employees feel very bad about themselves all the time because they're not operating at their best in the manager's eyes, and ultimately they get manipulated into doing what the manager wanted them to do, which generally sometimes wasn't even the correct thing, in terms of company policy or you know anything else. Um, a little turn by looking at the manager as a surveillant, instead of you're looking at the employee's perspective, you have to look at the managers as well. According to Singh et al. In a 2026 article, those tasked with monitoring others experience quote unquote surveillance stress, which is characterized by moral ambiguity and the feeling of being an organizational villain. They felt psychological strain, because they felt like a bad person by telling someone that they're doing something wrong, but they also wanted it to be done correctly. And my interview with the operations manager confirmed this. He mentioned that there was a very intense and hard balance between enforcing rules and maintaining a positive culture. And he often felt the pressure of being watched himself by corporate metrics and the managers above him. They never really understood how the floor worked and how the store operated on a day-to-day basis. They just saw the metrics and got mad at us. And they were very micromanaging towards him. And ultimately, he kind of felt the same pressure that the stricter managers enforce on the lower level employees. He often actually felt pressured by corporate to be a micromanager and kind of do things exactly as they wanted to do. But he often got in trouble with them because he dismissed what they wanted him to do because he felt and understood that it demoralized the employees, when stuff like that happened, and ultimately their work would turn out worse than anticipated. Um, Coming back to that theory X versus theory Y management, it draws from Ofosu Yeboah's ethnographic study and our textbook's discussion on class positions. We eventually see two styles, which is theory X, the assumption that employees are lazy and they need constant surveillance to remain productive, versus theory Y, which assumes that employees are self-motivated and benefit from the trust of their managers as well as being autonomous in their work. And in my interviews, I found that the stricter managers created a tense section where people talk less, while lackluster or relaxed managers allow for out of work bonds, like getting a beer after work, after a hard day. And ultimately, the employees became more comfortable working in those environments because they felt as if they were friends with their manager and they could talk to them, out in on things outside of work. And ultimately, they'd gain the trust of this manager and become more autonomous in their work, and it was always more beneficial than anything else. I actually brought these concepts up in my interviews, and they agreed that those two do exist, theory X and theory Y, but they thought it was more of a spectrum than anything. Than it was more of a spectrum than a violent, two opposite different sides. And the happy medium was actually between those two, where employees might need influence, especially if they're new to the job, but once they learn what's going on and how things work, leaning more to theory Y and giving them more autonomy showed more success. Ultimately, again, gaining the trust of the manager. My interview with the online order lead revealed that constant and intense surveillance leads to self-surveillance. In a role where every second is tracked, they internalize the discipline, and under stricter managers, they report feeling like less like themselves and more reserved, showing that the authority, the power, and the sometimes manipulation doesn't just control our bodies, it reshapes our minds. And this continues to tie into the docile bodies theory that I explained earlier, where we feel more robotic than human in our work while under strict management, and we kind of don't operate as ourselves anymore, but just as this body that's helping, complete a task that needs to be done that you don't sometimes even feel like doing, but you understand you have to do it. Research by Jank et al. In a 2024 article shows that there's a major side effect of surveillance, and that is it erodes trust. When we feel watched, we're less likely to engage in organizational citizenship behavior or the voluntary extras that we do for a team. My coworker interviews back this up, noting that when you feel doubted, you care less over time because the managers who create that feeling of you always do everything wrong. You ultimately don't want to put the effort in. You stop caring because if you put the effort in, they don't like it. They're not going to like it anyway. Why put effort into it? And that was a big thing that I experienced a lot. Something I experienced in my job. I would care less over time about what I did because sometimes I felt like I was doing it wrong just at all times. However, authority doesn't have to be damaging. Kie Poku in a 2019 article introduced the idea of interactional justice, which is the respect and honest explanations we get from supervisors. This acts as a physiological resource that prevents emotional exhaustion and burnout from employees and managers, especially when they're dealing with the added stress of customers on top of projects that they have to do. Um, we also have to look into the idea of organizational agents, which is managers serving as the primary source for employees to interpret their own value to the company. If a manager is encouraging you to do what you're doing and making you feel good about your work, then you feel valuable to the company and to the store, and you feel like you're having an impact, and ultimately your mental health goes through the roof, and you're just generally happy to go into work. When the opposite also happens, when the managers are beating you down for everything you do, and you start to you don't feel valuable because you don't feel like you're contributing anything good. And this brings us to my biggest point, which is George Orwell's 1984. The idea they're very close in concepts and themes. Retail surveillance in a modern era is a micro version of the Big Brother concept. Just as the telescreen in Oceania monitors every movement and expression to enforce uniformity, our digital logs and floor oversight create a world where, a world and a retail environment where we must always be kind of compliant to avoid punishment. And we start to engage in a form of doublethink, knowing that surveillance is there, but pretending to work naturally within it. And this ultimately helps us realize the connection that I'm trying to make. This retail form of surveillance and use of authority ultimately ties into and is it's my idea on a very small scale. The idea that a greater structure of power that we experience every day, which is power used by the government, they've increased their surveillance efforts in the modern era. Cameras that are able to track your face and your license plate to see where you're going at all times. And ultimately, that's just a huge invasion of privacy because you're getting monitored at all times. You're minding your own business, but they know where you are at all times because they want you to kind of lose your individuality and become more of a sheep to what's going on. And we're starting to lose our individuality again. We're starting to be more docile bodies and robots because that's what the government wants us to do. They want us to follow their rules exactly and be a perfect little citizen. But I think we need to find ways to kind of break out of that and find ways to be ourselves even with the surveillance, because ultimately that brings our mental health up, and we start to feel more better about ourselves in general. To conclude, my research shows that workplace culture is a social construction of reality shaped by those in power. Surveillance was more than a tool. It's a system of discipline and potential manipulation that influences our identity and our agency. And by understanding these dynamics, we can begin to question the frameworks handed to us by the elite and imagine more egalitarian ways to work and live. Thank you for watching, and these are all the sources that I used.